There is a language no living scholar can fully read. Inscriptions cover thousands of bronze mirrors, tomb walls, and dedicatory tablets across central Italy. Linguists have been working on them for over 2 centuries. They can transliterate every letter. They can identify certain words. But the grammar, the deep structure, the full meaning of the texts remains stubbornly, maddeningly out of reach. And that was just the language. In the hills of Tuscany and Umbria, in the region the Romans called Etruria, there existed a civilization that by any measure should be famous. The Etruscans built aqueducts and drained marshland. Their artists produced bronzework that Greek and Phoenician traders crossed the Mediterranean to acquire. Their women appeared at banquets alongside men in ways that scandalized visiting Greeks, who wrote about it with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and powerful, the dominant force in central Italy for centuries before Rome emerged from the hills south of the Tiber. And yet what we know about them remains oddly thin, filtered almost entirely through the accounts of the people who eventually absorbed and replaced them. For generations, historians offered a simple explanation for the Etruscan mystery. The language was unusual, yes. The culture was distinctive. But the people themselves, most scholars assumed, had simply been there, indigenous to Italy, emerging gradually from the preceding Iron Age cultures of the peninsula with no foreign origin, no dramatic arrival, no migration story to complicate the picture. It was a clean answer. It was also, as the genetics would eventually show, less than the whole truth. In 2021, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Science Advances that changed the terms of this debate in ways nobody had fully anticipated. They extracted and analyzed ancient DNA from 82 individuals buried across central Italy, spanning nearly 2,000 years of prehistory and history. From the period before the Etruscans existed as a distinct culture through the height of the Roman Republic. The goal was to settle the oldest and strangest question in Mediterranean archaeology: where did the Etruscans actually come from? The answer that came back from the laboratory was not the one anyone had been waiting for. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the shape of the question as it existed before the genetics arrived. Ancient historians disagreed about Etruscan origins with unusual ferocity. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, offered a specific and confident origin story. The Etruscans, he claimed, were migrants from Lydia, a kingdom in western Anatolia in what is today Turkey. A prolonged famine had driven half the population westward under a prince named Tyrrhenus, and they had eventually settled in Italy, bringing their foreign customs with them. For centuries, this account was treated as at best a legend and at worst a fabrication. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing later, flatly disagreed. The Etruscans, he insisted, were indigenous to Italy. They had always been there. Their language was their own, developed in place, connected to nothing outside the peninsula. 2 ancient historians, 2 irreconcilable stories, and no mechanism available for nearly 2,000 years to test either one against anything harder than inference. Modern archaeology, through most of the 20th century, sided with Dionysius. The material record told a story of continuity. Etruscan civilization appeared to develop directly from the preceding Villanovan culture of the Italian Iron Age, with no clean archaeological break. No sudden appearance of Anatolian pottery styles or foreign burial practices that would signal a mass migration. The Herodotian account was filed away as a myth, an ancient attempt to explain a distinctiveness that needed no external explanation. The consensus cautiously settled, and then the bones spoke. When the 2021 study returned its results, researchers found that the individuals buried in Etruscan cities at the height of their civilization carried a genetic ancestry profile that was, in the broadest statistical sense, almost indistinguishable from the Latin-speaking populations living alongside them. The same 3-way ancestral blend that characterized Bronze and Iron Age Italy as a whole appeared in Etruscan graves with no meaningful separation from what appeared in Roman ones. Neolithic Anatolian farmer ancestry, the deep substrate of most European populations since the agricultural revolution. Steppe pastoralist ancestry, carried westward by Bronze Age migrations that spread Indo-European languages across most of the continent. And older European hunter-gatherer ancestry woven through both. No distinct Lydian founding signal. No unique Eastern Mediterranean component setting them apart biologically from their neighbors. Genetically, the people who spoke this unreadable language appeared to be, in the most fundamental sense, ordinary Italians. This is the twist that changes everything, and it is precisely the kind of result that could be catastrophically misread. The tempting conclusion is that Herodotus was simply wrong, that the Anatolian migration story was pure invention, that there is no mystery left to explain once you accept that the Etruscans were native to Italy all along. But that reading misses what the genetics were actually pointing toward, which is a paradox far stranger and more interesting than any simple yes or no answer to an ancient rumor. Because here is what the biology cannot explain. The Etruscan language. Etruscan is not Indo-European. It bears no meaningful relationship to Latin, to Greek, to Oscan, to Umbrian, to any of the related languages spoken across the Italian peninsula. It is not a dialect of anything familiar. It is a linguistic island in a sea of connected tongues, and its grammar encodes a system of thought that emerged from somewhere entirely outside the Indo-European tradition. That tradition, spread by the very Bronze Age steppe migrations visible in Etruscan bones, eventually covered virtually all of Europe and large portions of Asia. The Etruscans lived inside that world genetically, but outside it linguistically for 1,000 years. Something does not add up. And this is where researchers had to fracture their thinking into two questions that most people assume are the same question. Where did the people come from? And where did the language come from? For most of human history and across most of the world, these two things travel together. A population migrates and its language migrates with it. Genes and grammar move as a package. The Etruscans appear to be a quiet but forceful demonstration that this is not a law of nature. It is only a common pattern. Somewhere in the deep prehistory of Italy, in a period predating the Bronze Age migrations that reshaped the genetic map of the entire continent, a pre-Indo-European language took root in central Italy. Not necessarily carried by a large foreign population, perhaps by a small group of traders, ritual specialists, or elites whose cultural influence was disproportionate to their numbers. That language embedded itself so completely into the local population that even as later waves of migration folded in new genetics, wave after wave of farmers and pastoralists arriving from east and north and south, the language itself survived, passed down through generations, absorbed by whichever genetic community happened to occupy that specific landscape at that specific time. In other words, the Etruscans were most likely not people who came from somewhere else and remained biologically distinct. They were, in all probability, the cultural descendants of an older pre-Indo-European linguistic tradition clinging to a genetically ordinary population, a tradition that had been there before the steppe migrations arrived and simply never let go. The Lydian legend, the researchers now suggest, may not have been pure fabrication. It may have been an ancient folk memory, however distorted and displaced across centuries of retelling, of a linguistic inheritance, whose true origin had already become mysterious even to the Etruscans themselves by the classical period. A memory of foreignness attached retroactively to a population that was, by the time Herodotus wrote, no longer foreign at all. There is a detail buried in the study's supplementary data that captures just how strange this really is. Among the individuals analyzed, researchers identified pairs of close biological relatives buried near each other at Etruscan sites. Some appear to have been interred as parent and child, including at least one pairing consistent with an adoptive relationship, evidence of a functioning and socially mobile community, with no biological wall separating it from Rome. Those same individuals, had they been able to speak, would have used a grammar utterly unlike Latin. A grammar that remains only partially decoded today, carved into the walls of tomes that their descendants built facing the direction of the setting sun for reasons we still do not fully understand. Two records in the same soil, one written in bone, one written in syllables, neither one lying, both describing something true that the other could not see. What makes this discovery matter beyond any single vanished civilization is what it reveals about the assumptions built into how we reconstruct the past. For decades, archaeologists and geneticists alike have often treated language, culture, and biology as three threads of the same rope, assuming that tracing one means effectively tracing all three. The Etruscan case is a patient rebuttal to that assumption. A people can be genetically continuous with their neighbors while remaining, for 1,000 years, linguistically and culturally distinct from them. Identity does not require a separate gene pool. It requires only a story, a language, a set of practices that a community decides, generation after generation, to maintain. The Etruscan language finally went silent sometime after the social war of the 1st century BCE, as Rome absorbed its former rivals so completely that being Etruscan came to mean, within a generation or two, simply being Roman. The temples fell into ruin. The tombs were sealed. The grammar that no army ever fully learned to speak eroded into a handful of inscriptions that scholars still argue over today. But the DNA remained, as it always remains, indifferent to the languages spoken over it, indifferent to the empires that rise and absorb their predecessors and rewrite the record afterward. And what the genome of an 800-year-old skeleton actually tells us is not which ancient historian was right, or which origin story deserves to survive. It tells us that the deepest layers of who a people are cannot always be read in their blood. Sometimes they are written only in the sounds a people refused, for 1,000 years, to stop making. The Etruscans were never simply what the history books described. They were never simply a local culture that emerged organically from an Italian Iron Age and faded quietly into Rome. They were a living archive of something older than the Indo-European world itself, a linguistic tradition that crossed every wave of migration and every attempt at cultural replacement and survived, generation after generation. Because the people who carried it chose to keep carrying it, the data is only beginning to tell us how old that archive actually is.